The condolence flowers were still alive when my wife tried to hand my father's company to her brother. She did it at 9:14 on a gray Tuesday morning while I was standing in Lakeview Cemetery with a stone catalog open on my lap, trying to decide whether my father would have hated polished granite or merely tolerated it for the sake of efficiency. The board packet hit inboxes 3 minutes after Natalie texted me a single sentence. "Take your time today. Don't worry about work. Connor and I are handling everything." Most men would read that and feel gratitude. I read it and checked the timestamp. Then I opened the packet, saw my brother-in-law's name typed into the interim chief executive line under the company my father built with $48, one-use lathe, and a refusal to bow his head to anyone, and I laughed so hard the groundskeeper glanced at me over a row of wet chrysanthemums like grief had finally snapped something loose. Maybe it had. Or maybe the snapping had happened 19 days earlier, in a private hospital room on the 7th floor of St. Joseph's, when my father gripped my wrist with the last real strength he had left and said, very clearly, because dying stripped all performance out of him, "Don't let family near the voting shares." I didn't. That is why what Natalie and Connor did next became the most expensive mistake either of them would ever make. My name is Julian Vale. I'm 37 years old. I run strategy and acquisitions for Vale Industrial Systems, the company my father spent 32 years building out of Cleveland before a stroke took him in 11 days. People like to use words like legacy when a rich man dies. They say empire if they want to flatter the dead and dynasty if they want to flatter themselves for having stood close enough to the funeral spray. My father would have called all that nonsense. He built precision fabrication plants, bought distressed suppliers nobody else wanted, fixed operations everybody else thought were beyond saving, and turned those parts into contracts that kept 614 people employed across Ohio, Michigan, and western Pennsylvania. He also built it in a way that made ambition look simple from the outside. That was his best trick. From the street, Vale Industrial looked like a handsome old brick headquarters with a modern annex and a polished lobby where everything smelled faintly of coffee, machine oil, and expensive wood cleaner. From the inside, it was a living map of my father's mind. There were redundancies where other owners were careless, quiet backup agreements in locked files, cousins of cousins on payroll only if they could survive being treated more harshly than strangers, and a corporate structure so carefully segmented that anyone trying to seize control in a moment of chaos would find themselves walking into doors they hadn't realized were steel. Natalie never understood that. She understood optics. She understood which wine to order when bankers visited. She understood how to put a hand on my forearm during charity galas in a way that made older board members call us a strong couple. She understood, better than anyone I've ever known, how to enter a room already carrying the assumption that she belonged at the center of it. We met when I was 29 and she was 26, at a fundraising dinner for pediatric cancer research where she corrected a donor about French pronunciation without making him feel humiliated. That alone should have warned me. It takes unusual talent to make a man thank you for being diminished. I married her 14 months later. At the time, I told myself it was because she was brilliant, disciplined, and impossible to intimidate. All of that was true. What I missed was that some people are fearless because they have principles. And some people are fearless because shame simply doesn't take root in them the way it does in the rest of us. If you're wondering whether there were signs, there are always signs. The problem is that signs look a lot like confidence when you're still in love. They look like decisiveness. They look like standards. They look like someone who expects the world to make room. I didn't understand until much later that Natalie never entered a system without immediately calculating where it could be bent, who was sentimental, who was vain, and which loyalties were weaker than they sounded. My father saw pieces of it before I did. Not enough to stop the wedding. Enough to keep his distance. Elias Vale had a face that looked carved out of old hardwood. He wasn't warm in public and only selectively warm in private. He loved deeply, but he loved like an engineer. If he trusted you, you found out through access, not speeches. He'd hand you a set of numbers he wasn't showing anyone else. He'd ask your opinion before the board meeting instead of after it. He'd remember the name of your daughter and the month your lease renewed and whether your mother had made it through surgery. He wasn't sentimental about people, but he was attentive. Which, in the long run, is a better form of love. Natalie hated that he didn't melt for her. He was courteous. Never openly hostile. But he had a way of pausing one beat too long after her suggestions, as if checking them for hidden blades. She noticed. Of course she noticed. My younger sister Claire noticed too, though Claire notices everything because she grew up surviving by turning emotional weather into data. Claire is 34, a pediatric surgeon in Chicago, and the only person in my family who can look at a complicated human situation and slice through it without needing applause afterward. She liked Natalie the way one respects a beautifully designed knife, enough to admire the craftsmanship, never enough to put it in the wrong hands. The week before my father died, Claire flew in 3 times between shifts. Natalie came twice and made both visits visible. Once with flowers so elaborate the nurses had to move equipment to fit them by the window. Once with homemade soup she didn't make. I know she didn't make it because the container still had the label from a French place in Shaker Heights on the bottom, and because Natalie regards cooking the way aristocrats once regarded dying in public, regrettable, unbecoming, and best left to people whose options are narrower. I said nothing. I said nothing about a lot of things then. Grief had already started before death actually arrived, and anticipatory grief does something ugly to your instincts. It tells you to conserve emotional energy by ignoring what you would ordinarily confront. It tells you there will be time later. It tells you that after the funeral, after the paperwork, after the casseroles stop arriving and the calls slow down, then you'll sort out what felt wrong. That is the lie betrayal counts on. When my father finally died, it was 4:12 in the morning on a Friday, raining hard enough that the hospital windows looked painted over. I had fallen asleep in the chair with my shoes still on. Claire was in the corner under a blanket she hadn't unfolded so much as wrapped around herself like a field dressing. My father's breathing had been rough for hours, that terrible mechanical effort the body makes when it no longer remembers how to stay. Then it stopped. Not dramatically. Not like movies. Just one breath, another that barely qualified, and then the smallest absence in the world becoming the biggest. Claire made a sound I'd never heard from her before. I reached for the call button and missed it twice. Natalie arrived 26 minutes later in a black coat that fit perfectly and mascara that had been carefully smudged into the suggestion of tears. She held my face in both hands and told me she was so sorry. Anybody watching would have believed her. The charge nurse certainly did. So did 2 of the board members who showed up by sunrise carrying coffee and the dazed expressions of men who understood instinctively that a founder's death rearranges gravity. What nobody but me saw was the speed of Natalie's eyes. Not cruel. Not cold. Just active. Cataloging who had arrived. Which lawyer had called. Whether Richard Sloan from First Midwest had spoken to me privately. Whether Claire looked included or isolated. Whether the company's CFO, Marianne Keats, was avoiding direct eye contact. People think greed announces itself loudly. Usually it whispers and takes attendance first. The funeral was 4 days later, held in a church my father attended mostly because my mother had loved it before cancer took her 13 years earlier. He didn't trust institutions much, but he trusted habits that had once comforted her. The sanctuary was full. Machinists in dark suits beside private equity partners. Plant supervisors beside city officials. Men who had spent 20 years cursing him with affection. Women from accounting crying openly into handkerchiefs. Claire read from Ecclesiastes without breaking. I gave the eulogy and made it 3 minutes longer than I intended because every time I looked up I found another face that existed, in some practical way, because my father had once decided to keep a line open instead of shutting it down. Natalie sat in the front row holding my aunt's hand. Connor sat 2 rows behind her. That placement mattered, though I didn't understand how much until later. Connor Baird is 41, broad-shouldered, handsome in the kind of way that looks expensive even when he's underdressed, and built almost entirely out of appetites. He'd failed upward his whole adult life through a combination of confidence, charm, and the useful fact that other people kept absorbing the cost of his mistakes. He'd done 6 months in commercial real estate, 14 months in a sports marketing startup, 2 years pretending to build a boutique whiskey brand, and nearly 3 seasons on the board of a regional arts nonprofit where he spent most of his energy trying to be photographed from his left side. What Connor had never done, not once, was run anything that depended on competence. What he had always wanted was access to something already built. My father called him a decorative liability after meeting him the 3rd time. I told him that was harsh. He told me harsh and inaccurate are 2 different things. At the reception after the funeral, I spent 3 hours being hugged, thanked, cornered, praised, and assigned symbolic meanings I had not earned. Founder's son. Natural successor. Steady hand. The future. I hated all of it. My father had been dead less than 6 hours in the ground, and already men with careful voices were using language designed to see whether I would shrink from responsibility or lunge for it too soon. I gave them nothing. That was one lesson my father had drilled into me early. Whoever talks first in a transition usually pays for it. Near the dessert table, Natalie appeared with Connor beside her and said, in that light social tone that fools people who don't know how much damage can be packed inside a well-manicured sentence, "Julian, a few of the investors were asking whether you've thought about bringing in more family support while you take time to mourn." "Not support," Claire said from my left without looking away from the widow of one of our former plant managers. "Supervision. That's the word you're shopping for." Natalie smiled at her like one smiles at a child who has announced she'd like to become a horse. "You're exhausted, Claire. And you're transparent," Claire said. Connor laughed softly, as though the women were indulging in a charming sibling skirmish. He put a hand on my shoulder. "If you need me, brother, genuinely, I can help carry some weight for a few weeks. No ego. Just until things settle." I stared at his hand until he removed it. Then I thanked him. That was all. People misunderstand restraint. They think if you don't respond dramatically, you haven't understood the insult. Usually the opposite is true. The more dangerous the situation, the quieter some of us get. That night, back in the house Natalie and I shared in Hunting Valley, I stood in my father's study, because my father had practically lived there the last decade, and after my mother died he'd spent enough nights in our guest suite during acquisition cycles that one room had slowly become his even in my house, and opened the leather portfolio Marianne Keats had sent over by courier with a note that read "Only you." Inside were the updated trust documents. The revised share structure. The voting controls. And a sealed envelope with my father's handwriting on the front. "Julian. Open if I die before Monday's meeting." I sat in his chair to do it. The paper inside was plain legal pad stock, torn from the top cleanly. The writing slanted harder than usual, evidence of the stroke beginning its quiet sabotage even before we knew to call it that. "Son. If this note is in your hands, then events have become less hypothetical than I would have preferred. First, breathe. Second, read every attachment before speaking to anyone about structure, succession, or temporary control. Third, if Natalie pushes Connor's name in the first 2 weeks, assume she is not improvising." He'd underlined the last sentence twice. I remember setting the page down and feeling the back of my neck go cold. Not because I was shocked. Because I wasn't. That was the worst part. The note went on for 2 pages. It laid out, in clean bullets, the mechanisms he had put into place after what he referred to as several observations and one inadvisable lunch conversation. Natalie, it turned out, had approached him 8 months earlier with a polished proposal about family continuity leadership, language vague enough to sound caring, specific enough to reveal intent. She had suggested that in the event of a health emergency, a non-spousal family council might stabilize optics. Connor's name had appeared twice. My father had listened, said very little, and spent the next week rebuilding the defensive architecture of the company like a man boarding windows before a storm only he could see. He moved the controlling voting block into a founder's trust whose trustee could not be replaced without 2 independent signatures and a medical incapacity review. He attached executive authority to performance covenants Connor could not possibly satisfy. He created a contingent golden share that activated only upon founder death or proven coercion during bereavement. And he wrote, at the bottom of the second page, in handwriting so hard it nearly tore the paper. You are grieving, not absent. Do not let anyone confuse the two. I didn't sleep that night. At 6:10 the next morning, Natalie found me in the kitchen in yesterday's suit with 3 untouched cups of coffee lined up beside the trust documents. You haven't been to bed, she said. Neither have you, I said. She kissed my forehead. People cope differently. That's true. She slid into the chair across from me and folded her hands. Her voice dropped into that careful register she uses when she wants to sound softer than the substance beneath it. I've been thinking about you. About what the next month is going to look like. About how much pressure is already circling. Pressure always circles. Julian. I looked up. You don't have to prove anything right now, she said. Your father just died. Nobody decent expects you to walk straight back into that building and carry his whole world without breathing first. There are moments when a sentence is technically kind and strategically placed. This was one. I said nothing, so she continued. Connor knows operations well enough to keep meetings moving. Mary Ann trusts him. Richard likes him. If we positioned it as a temporary stewardship arrangement, just for optics, it would buy you room. I let the silence sit between us until she mistook it for uncertainty. Not because I enjoyed it. Because information blooms in silence. Would that make you feel safer? I asked. Safer for you, she said quickly. And there it was. Not safer for the company. Not better for employees. Safer for me. The language of enclosure. Of gentle removal. Of being wrapped, kindly, away from the controls while other hands learned the levers. I folded the note from my father once and slid it back into the envelope. I'll think about what support looks like, I said. Natalie reached for my hand. From anyone else, it would have felt like concern. From her, in that moment, it felt like measurement. Over the next 4 days, I watched my own house become a transit point for quiet ambition. Connor came by twice, both times with food nobody ate and casual questions nobody should ask unless they're already mapping a takeover. Which board members had called most often? Whether the lenders were nervous. If the new aerospace contract had finally closed. Whether Mary Ann seemed overwhelmed. Whether the Toledo plant was still having staffing trouble on second shift. One question would have meant nothing. 16 meant intent. Natalie started using phrases like bandwidth and emotional space. She said them in the same tone some people use for prayer. By Monday, I knew 3 things with complete certainty. 1. They believed grief had softened my pattern recognition. 2. They thought my father's death had created a procedural vacuum. 3. They had no idea my father had expected them specifically. That Monday was supposed to be the first succession meeting. It never happened the way they planned. But before I tell you what took place in the boardroom, you need to understand the part of this story that made Natalie's move so much uglier than ordinary greed. My father and I were not easy men with each other. We loved each other. Fiercely, I think. But not simply. When I was 12, he taught me how to read a balance sheet before he taught me how to shave. When I was 15, he brought me into Plant 2 on a Sunday and made me stand beside a stamping press for 20 minutes in ear protection until I could explain, without notes, why a half-second delay in maintenance protocols could turn margin into injury. When I was 19 and came home from Northwestern full of polished vocabulary and theoretical brilliance, he handed me steel-toed boots and put me on overnight inventory for 6 weeks. Not because he enjoyed humiliating me. Because he believed inheritance without contact with reality makes cowards. We fought all through my 20s. About expansion. About debt appetite. About his refusal to delegate. About my suspicion that he trusted only dead men and machines. The first acquisition I led nearly blew up because I underestimated labor resentment in a plant outside Dayton. He didn't rescue me publicly. He let me bleed through the meeting, then took me to dinner afterward and spent 2 hours explaining exactly where my ego had outpaced my listening. I hated him a little that night. 2 years later I thanked him for it. By 33, we had become something I can only describe as mutually armed respect. He no longer treated me like an heir being tested. I no longer treated him like an obstacle made of habit and old power. We built together. Not gracefully. Not sentimentally. But honestly. The month before he died, after the first stroke warning none of us understood as a warning, he asked me to drive him to the lake house in Vermilion. He said he wanted quiet. He hated being watched when he was tired. We sat on the back deck wrapped in cold wind off the water while he ate half a grilled cheese and ignored the tomato soup. He asked me whether Natalie still pressed for more visibility in the company. I said sometimes. He nodded once. Then he asked whether Connor had mentioned board participation again. I said yes. Another nod. Then he stared out at the water for so long I thought the conversation had ended. Finally he said, "There are people who think proximity is contribution." I waited. "If I die suddenly," he said, "nobody gets rewarded for standing near me." I asked him if this was about Natalie. He gave me the look he reserved for questions he considered either lazy or dishonest. "It's about incentives," he said. "Names are just decorations on incentives." That was my father. Even at the edge of frailty, he refused to dignify manipulation by treating it like melodrama. To him, human behavior was a system. Follow the incentives, inspect the pressure points, remove the fantasy language people use to perfume what they want, and the structure usually reveals itself. That framework saved me later. Because grief makes everything personal. Systems keep you from drowning in it. The morning Natalie and Connor sent the interim appointment packet, I was still at the cemetery when my phone began vibrating in rapid sequence. First Marianne. Then Claire. Then Richard Sloan, our oldest outside director and the sort of man who makes every sentence sound pre-approved by 3 lawyers and an episcopal conscience. I let all 3 calls ring out. Instead, I called our general counsel, Priya Shah. She picked up on the first ring. "You saw it," she said. "Yes. And I'd like you to tell me whether the sender copied the whole board or only the members Natalie believes are persuadable." A beat of silence. Then, with unmistakable satisfaction, Priya said, "I wondered whether you'd ask that before anything else." Who got it? 7 board members. 2 observers. Not Marianne. Not me. Not the union representative. Not Richard, though someone forwarded it to him within 4 minutes. So it was a shopping expedition, not a meeting notice. That's my reading. Who drafted it? Connor's assistant sent it from a private domain. Metadata traces back to a laptop registered to your home network. I looked across the cemetery at the wet grass, the rows of stone, the little gathering tent still folded from the burial 2 days earlier, and felt something inside me go very still. Home network. My house. At my table. While I had been arranging my father's obituary revisions, choosing casket hardware, and making sure my aunt was taking her blood pressure medication, my wife had been building a transfer packet off my own wireless signal. The ugliness of betrayal is rarely in the ambition itself. Ambition is common. It's the venue that wounds you. The kitchen where somebody asks whether you've eaten while also positioning the knife. When can you get to the office? Priya asked. 40 minutes. Good. Don't warn them. I had no intention of doing so. On the drive downtown, Claire called again. I answered this time. Tell me you saw it, she said without greeting. I saw it. tell me you're furious. I'm busy. Julian. Claire has always known when my calm is genuine and when it is the thin lid over something volcanic. I heard her exhale. Okay, she said. That's worse. Are you at the hospital? Parking garage. I turned around when Marianne texted me. Do you want me there? Yes. As sister or witness? Both. She didn't ask anything else. That is one of the purest forms of loyalty, not making the person under siege spend extra energy explaining the obvious. By the time I reached headquarters, the lobby had that charged stillness offices get when scandal is moving faster than official communication. The receptionist, Kelly, stood as I came through the door. Her eyes went briefly to the black tie I was still wearing from the cemetery and then away. Behind her, through glass, I could see Connor in the conference alcove speaking too broadly with his hands to two junior finance analysts who were pretending not to look uncomfortable. He turned when he saw me. And smiled. That smile told me everything. Not triumph exactly. Premature ownership. Julian, he said, crossing toward me like we were about to discuss seating at a fundraiser. I was just trying to get ahead of some concern out there before it becomes noise. Interesting, I said. Because from where I stand, you appear to be the noise. His smile held for 1 second too long. Natalie emerged from the corridor beside executive offices with Marianne 2 steps behind her and Priya half a pace behind Marianne. That spacing told its own story too. Natalie first, because she still believed appearance could govern reality. Marianne behind, rigid with contained fury. Priya last, expressionless in the terrifying way only excellent attorneys can manage when they already know where the bodies are buried and simply haven't decided in which order to name them. Julian, Natalie said softly, I didn't want you blindsided. You sent the packet while I was at the cemetery. Her face performed injury. I sent it while you were taking personal time because I thought it would be cruel to drag you in before we had something concrete to relieve the burden. Connor nodded like a supportive consultant. Nobody is making anything permanent here, he said. It's just a structure. Temporary operational stewardship. You know how founders' deaths look to lenders. You think lenders are the issue? Marianne said. Connor looked at her with the patient condescension insecure men reserve for competent women over 50. I think continuity matters. It does, Marianne said. Which is why this little theater is over. Natalie turned to me, lowering her voice. We can do this privately if you want. No, I said. I don't. That was the first moment I saw real uncertainty flash across her face. Until then, she still believed the situation was fundamentally emotional. Husband in pain. Wife managing realities he could not. Brother offering support. Even if I objected, she assumed it would be from wounded pride, not structural preparation. She did not yet understand she'd walked into engineering, not emotion. I asked Kelly to reserve boardroom A and invite every sitting director, every observer, general counsel, CFO, and our outside audit chair for an emergency succession clarification session in 20 minutes. Connor started to object. I lifted one hand and he stopped talking. It wasn't dominance. Not the theatrical kind, anyway. It was simply the first time he realized I was not participating in the version of this story he had rehearsed. While the room assembled, I went into my father's office for the first time since his death. Not mine. His. The nameplate outside still read Elias Vale in brushed steel. The office smelled like cedar, paper, and the particular tobacco leather cologne he'd worn for 20 years despite repeated pleas from Claire that it made him smell like a wealthy arsonist. His glasses were folded beside a marked-up supplier report. A yellow legal pad sat square to the desk edge, top page blank. It was so aggressively ordinary that I had to grip the chair back until the first hard wave of grief passed. There is a strange violence in untouched objects after someone dies. They accuse the world of continuing. I took exactly 90 seconds. Then I opened the lower right drawer, removed the black folio Priya and I had placed there 3 weeks earlier after my father's hospital warning, and walked back into the boardroom with every document required to ruin 3 people's month. The room filled slowly, which is to say it filled like every high-stakes room fills, with people pretending nothing unusual is happening while their body language betrays them completely. Richard Sloane sat at the far end, hands folded, expression grave. Marianne was to his right, already annotated notebook open. Priya had connected to the screen. Audit Chair Lendover looked annoyed in the way men do when they've been forced into an emergency that might expose previously unknown mess. 2 labor observers joined by video from Toledo and Youngstown. Claire slipped into the chair against the wall, not formally entitled to be present and too dangerous to be excluded. Natalie chose a seat beside mine. Connor chose one across from me. That was a mistake. Across the table men always think eye contact is a weapon until somebody stronger decides to use it as a mirror. I opened the meeting without greeting anyone. You have all received an unauthorized packet proposing the temporary installation of Connor Baird as interim chief executive during my bereavement, I said. Before anyone mistakes personal access for institutional authority, we're going to clarify the structure in force. Connor leaned back. His cufflinks flashed under the lights. Nobody mistook anything, Julian. We were trying to help. Priya put the first document on screen. Founders Trust Amendment, effective 9 months prior. Then the second. Executive Succession Trigger Matrix. Then the third. Protective Voting Share Certification. I watched comprehension move through the room in stages. First interest. Then concentration. Then the subtle physical reset people make when they realize the surface narrative has been false from the beginning. Richard removed his glasses. Marianne stopped writing and simply sat back, satisfaction almost visible. Natalie's face didn't change at all. That was impressive, in its way. Connor's did. What is this? He asked. This, Priya said, is the documentation you would have reviewed before trying to install yourself as interim chief executive if your objective had actually been governance rather than opportunism. Lendover looked from the screen to me. Elias did this recently. Yes, I said. Why wasn't the full board briefed? Because the triggers were contingent, Priya answered. Founder death, coercive transfer effort during bereavement, or attempted interference by non-qualified family actors. 2 of those contingencies have now been implicated. The word implicated landed like a dropped tool. Natalie finally spoke. That is an extremely inflammatory characterization for an effort made in good faith. Claire laughed. Out loud. Good faith is a wild description for sending a control packet from our home Wi-Fi while my brother was picking headstone material. Every head in the room turned. Natalie's jaw tightened once. She recovered quickly. I didn't hide anything. I was trying to prevent market instability. By appointing your brother? Richard asked quietly. Temporarily. To a role he is unqualified for. Marianne said. Qualification is subjective, Connor snapped. Not in manufacturing, Marianne said. Not in debt structuring. Not in labor negotiation. Not in aerospace compliance. Not in any field relevant to the company you tried to climb into before the flowers from the funeral died. Connor reddened. I am not some outsider. No, I said. Outsiders sometimes have manners. The silence after that was clean and cold. Connor looked at Natalie as if expecting her to step in, reinterpret, reframe. Natalie instead fixed on me with new attention, the way a chess player studies the board after discovering the trap wasn't accidental. How long? She asked. I knew exactly what she meant. How long had I known she would try something? How long had my father known? How long had the room I shared with her been occupied by somebody she hadn't measured correctly? Long enough, I said. Priya moved to the next slide, qualification covenants. If any interim executive were to be appointed during founder transition, said candidate must satisfy 3 of 5 conditions. Minimum 7 years of directly relevant operating leadership. Demonstrated oversight of unionized workforce above 200 employees. Approved security clearance for defense-adjacent contracts. Existing lender familiarity ratified by both senior credit partners. And ratification by the founder's trust trustee. Connor met none of them. Neither did Natalie. Neither did any person she might have dressed up as concern. And because my father was my father, he had added one more mechanism. The golden share. Not public. Not activated unless required. A single protective voting instrument whose power rested with me upon his death and whose existence became operational only when a coercive attempt was made to bypass the intended succession architecture. Priya explained it in under 2 minutes. Richard said, with almost reverent disbelief, "Elias, old devil." He really thought of everything, Marianne muttered. Not everything, I said before I meant to. Grief roughened the last word. My throat closed unexpectedly. For one embarrassing second I couldn't continue. Claire looked down instead of rescuing me, which was exactly right. She has always understood that dignity sometimes means letting someone survive the moment themselves. I took a breath. Not everything, I said again. But enough. What followed might have ended there if Natalie had chosen retreat. She didn't. That was her second mistake. Her first was believing she understood the structure. Her second was believing she still understood me. She folded her hands on the table and switched strategies in real time. I watched it happen. Outrage had failed. Soft concern had failed. So now she reached for intimacy as leverage. Julian, she said, I think you're combining your father's paranoia with your grief and turning a support plan into an accusation because you need somewhere to place anger. A few years earlier that sentence would have staggered me. Not because it was true. Because it was expertly built. Half psychology, half tenderness, 1 part public embarrassment. The kind of sentence that makes bystanders wonder whether maybe the wife is the reasonable one and the son is, understandably, spiraling. Instead I asked Priya to display Appendix D. She did. It was an email chain. Printed timestamps. Cross-domain metadata. Archived from a recovery server Natalie did not know we mirrored after an IT breach 18 months earlier. At the top was an email from Natalie to Connor, sent 11 days before my father died. Subject, timing window. My father had been unconscious for 6 hours when she wrote it. The body of the email was short. If the doctors are right, we may have a narrow period where Julian is too emotionally compromised to resist a temporary arrangement if it's framed as protection. We need language that sounds compassionate, not ambitious. Richard will be the obstacle. Marianne can be isolated if we position her as overwhelmed. Do not get greedy in writing. Connor's response, 6 minutes later. Understood. Temporary first. Then review after 60 days. Once people adjust, permanence gets easier. Nobody in the room moved. Not immediately. Shock often looks less like gasping than like everyone remembering, at the same time, that bodies can become very still. Natalie looked at the screen. Then at Priya. Then at me. Illegal, she said. No, Priya said. Unfortunate for you. Not illegal. That depends on consent, Natalie said. On company devices and networks. Priya replied. With active governance concerns. Try again. Connor stood so abruptly his chair struck the credenza behind him. This is insane. You spied on family. I stood too. No, Connor, I said. We secured a company. Don't flatter yourself. You were waiting for an excuse to cut us out. Us. There it was. The tiny honest plural greed always leaks eventually. Not Natalie supporting me. Not Connor helping family. Us. A block. A unit. An extraction team dressed in wedding clothes and holiday politeness. You were never in, I said. That hit him harder than the documents. Some truths do. He lunged toward the far end of the table with that forward shoulder posture men adopt when they want aggression to do the talking their competence never could. Len Dover rose halfway. Richard said Connor's name once, sharply. Claire was already on her feet. But Marianne, 61 years old and made of tempered iron, stepped directly into Connor's path before anyone else could. You will not perform masculinity in this room, she said. Sit down or security will sit you down for you. Connor stopped. Not because he respected her. Because bullies calculate, and for the first time that morning the math no longer favored motion. Natalie remained seated. That frightened me more. Rage I understand. A still predator recalculating is another thing entirely. The meeting adjourned 18 minutes later with 3 formal resolutions. 1. The board recognized the existing succession structure already in force under founder directives. 2. Any further effort by non-executive family members to influence interim authority would be documented as interference. 3. Outside counsel and audit would review all communications related to attempted governance manipulation during the founder transition period. Everyone voted yes except one abstention from Len, who later told me he only abstained because he wanted to read every page twice before attaching his name to human stupidity this expensive. Connor left first. He didn't slam the door. Men like him rarely do when the room has stopped admiring them. Natalie waited until the others filed out. Claire lingered by the wall. Priya stayed by the screen. Richard pretended to study the skyline. My wife turned to me and asked, very quietly, when did you stop trusting me? I almost answered honestly. The first honest answer would have been something like, when I realized you regarded closeness as a route of access instead of a form of care. The second would have been, I trusted you longer than was wise. What I said was, I didn't stop today. That hurt her. Good. She rose, smoothing the front of her navy dress with fingers that had not shaken once all morning. You could have come to me privately. You sent your brother after my father's company while I was choosing his grave marker. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Sometimes shame arrives late. Sometimes it only arrives when the room empties and there are no witnesses left to perform for. Claire moved then, stepping fully into Natalie's line of sight. If you had loved him at all, Claire said, you would have waited long enough to let the dirt settle. Natalie flinched. Very small. But real. Then she walked out. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. That exposure corrected everything. That greed, once lit properly, crawls back into whatever hole it came from. It doesn't. Exposure changes tactics. That's all. The afternoon after the board meeting, I found out just how deep Natalie had already gone. Marianne closed my office door at 4:35, set a thick folder on the desk, and said, there are 3 levels to a takeover attempt. Optics, governance, and cash. They failed on governance. I think they started on cash. Inside the folder were reimbursement ledgers, consulting invoices, vendor approvals, and 2 provisional payment authorizations flagged by internal controls and held, thankfully, before release. All of them had something in common. Soft names. Harmless names. Transition communications support. Executive continuity advisory. Stakeholder stabilization consulting. Corporate language is one of the great laundering tools of modern theft. Dress a grab in enough syllables and half the world mistakes it for procedure. The advisory firm listed on the invoices was called North Briar Strategic. Delaware registration. 3 months old. No real staff. Mailing address shared with 2 dissolved shell entities and a boutique wine importer in Stamford. The approving contact for all 3 draft invoices was an assistant in Natalie's personal foundation office. Amounts? I asked. If all tranches cleared, 1.8 million over 60 days. For what? For being related to your wife, Marianne said. I leaned back slowly. Grief had not left me. It was in everything. In the ache behind my sternum. In the way every room still contained some version of my father if I turned too fast. In the sudden blank moments where I remembered I could not call him anymore and the world stuttered. But layered over the grief now was something colder. Not revenge exactly. Revenge is emotional. This was custodial. The feeling of being handed a building after a fire and discovering the people smiling beside you had also tried to siphon copper from the walls. Who else knows? I asked. Priya. Audit. Richard, in broad strokes. No one outside. Good. Marianne studied me. You're taking this very calmly. No, I said. I'm taking it very precisely. That earned the first almost smile I'd seen from her since my father died. He'd be insufferably pleased with that answer. Later that evening I went home. I use the word home because language is habit, even after meaning has started to rot. The house sat on 11 acres behind stone pillars and copper beeches, all discreet money and understated old ambition. Natalie had overseen the redesign 3 years earlier, taking the original warm, masculine interiors and bleaching them into magazine elegance. Pale oak. Cream upholstery. Curated restraint. She said the old rooms felt heavy. My father said they felt expensive in a way that implied apology. When I walked in, she was in the breakfast room with her laptop open, a tumbler of sparkling water at one elbow, sunset turning the windows bronze behind her. For one irrational second, she looked so exactly like my wife in an ordinary weekday scene that my body misfired and reached toward the familiar before memory intervened. Betrayal is not only emotional. It's neurological. The mind has to reteach the body what danger now looks like. We need to talk, she said. We did that in the boardroom. No. We performed in the boardroom. Interesting distinction. I didn't sit. She closed the laptop. Julian, what happened today was avoidable. I laughed once. That sound seemed to irritate her more than anger would have. You humiliated my brother. Your brother humiliated himself. Repeatedly. Publicly. With help. This isn't a game. No, Natalie. That's why it bothers you. There are fights between spouses that are still, somehow, intimate. Even when they're vicious, there remains a shared premise beneath them. A sense that both people are still arguing from inside the same structure. This was no longer that. I could feel the architecture between us gone. She wasn't my wife across a conflict. She was an operator assessing damaged leverage. You think because Elias distrusted me, she said, that gives you permission to rewrite years of marriage as if I've always been your enemy. I think emailing your brother about a timing window while my father was dying gave me that permission. Her face hardened fully then. Not the polished injury. Not the soft disbelief. The actual steel underneath. So that was the play, she said. Dig. Monitor. Archive. Wait. Yes. At least we're finally honest. She stood. We were almost the same height, which mattered to her more than it did to me. Natalie has always hated having to look up at people when power is contested. Do you want honesty? Fine. Your father was suffocating this company with paranoia. He trusted nobody. He built everything around himself and around you, and everyone else had to wait for scraps of access. I was trying to create continuity. By placing Connor in charge. By placing family in the line of sight so the transition didn't spook the market. Family, I repeated. Your family. You were my family. Were. That tiny tense change landed between us like cut glass. For the first time all day, I saw something unperformed flicker in her eyes. Not remorse. Not love. Something closer to offended disbelief that I had dared to move her, grammatically, out of position. Then it vanished. I asked her one question. When were you going to tell me about North Briar Strategic? She didn't answer quickly enough. There is no substitute for the first second after a hidden thing is named. People's real relationship to truth lives there, before recovery, before spin. I watched calculation race across her face. It was a contingency, she said. $1.8 million of contingencies. Consulting support for transition management. To whom? To people with the skill set to stabilize communications. Name one. She didn't. Because she couldn't. Because North Briar was smoke with invoices attached. I told her I wanted access to every shared account, foundation ledger, discretionary household transfer, and personal device used to discuss company matters within the hour. She asked if I was threatening her. I told her no. Threats imply uncertainty about whether I'll act. She slapped me. Not hard. Hard enough to make sound. Hard enough to feel less like passion than punctuation. I've replayed that moment more than most of the larger ones, which probably says something unflattering about me. Not because the slap hurt. It barely did. Not because I had never imagined she might become physical. People under exposure do strange things. But because the second after it happened, she looked relieved. As if crossing into something cruder, something undeniable, finally allowed her to stop pretending the marriage still had a script worth preserving. I touched my face once. Then I said, Claire was right about you. That hit. Deeply. Natalie and Claire had spent 9 years conducting a quiet war in which neither openly insulted the other and both spoke fluent contempt. Claire had diagnosed her early. Natalie had never forgiven the diagnosis. Get out, Natalie said. This is my house. No, she said. It's where you sleep. That is not the same thing. It was a cruel sentence. Also an illuminating one. Because it clarified what she thought marriage had been. Not partnership. Occupancy. Access. A mutually useful arrangement in which location, status, and adjacency had been the real vows. I walked upstairs, packed one carry-on, my father's folio, 3 suits, toiletries, and the watch my mother gave him on their 10th anniversary. I left the wedding album on the shelf. I left the framed black and white photograph from St. Barthélemy. I left the stupid silver bowl we got as a registry gift from a couple in Greenwich who believed every marriage should begin with decorative metal no one will ever use. On the landing, I found Natalie standing in the hallway outside our bedroom. Our bedroom. Another habit word. She had regained control of her face. Her voice too. If you walk out tonight, she said, things become more difficult than they need to be. For whom? For everyone. There it was again. Everyone. The plural shield people use when they don't want to name their own interests directly. I took one more step toward the stairs. Julian. I turned. She looked almost tired. I did love you. Did, I said. That's a difficult tense tonight. I left before she could answer. I spent the next 11 nights in the top-floor suite of the Ashbury Hotel downtown, the kind of discreet luxury place where staff understand that wealthy grief often arrives carrying luggage and an expression people do not question. The suite had a view of the river, too much marble, and blackout curtains so effective they made mornings feel optional. Claire came by the second night with Thai food and 2 pairs of socks because, according to her, men in shock forget their feet exist. She took one look at my face and asked, did she hit you? Yes. Do you want me to ruin her career personally or professionally? I remember laughing then. Genuinely. First time in days. Professionally has better resale value, I said. Good answer. Claire opened containers across the coffee table and waited until I ate before saying the harder things. You know this doesn't end at the company, right? I know. She'll protect herself. I know. She'll say you turned cold after your father died, that she tried to help, that your father's distrust poisoned the marriage. Also no. She studied me while unwrapping chopsticks. Then she said, what's bothering you most isn't the company. No. What is it? I set my fork down. That I can't tell how much of it was real. Claire didn't rush to fill the silence after that. God, I loved her for that. Lesser people hurry to reassure. They tell you some of it must have been real, as if ratios comfort the betrayed. They don't. Nothing gets easier because 38% of a marriage may have been sincere. Finally Claire said, maybe that's the wrong question. Then what is the right one? What did it cost you to believe the wrong thing for so long? That stayed with me. Because cost can be counted. And once something can be counted, it can be faced. The next morning, I met with Priya and an outside forensic team in a conference room rented off-site. We worked 8 hours straight. Device mirroring. Account tracing. Approval chains. Foundation transfers. Metadata pulls. The pattern that emerged was ugly, disciplined, and older than I'd wanted to imagine. Natalie hadn't suddenly become predatory when my father died. She had been preparing for a leverage event for at least a year. Nothing so vulgar as outright theft at first. More like prepositioning. Building relationships with 2 of our smaller investors. Hosting private dinners where Connor happened to be seated near men whose opinions could be translated into pressure later. Encouraging the narrative that I was brilliant but over-identified with my father, as if adulthood were a flaw. Asking seemingly innocent questions about trust structures. Inviting Marianne less often to charity committees while mentioning, to others, that Marianne seemed stretched. Individually, each move was survivable. Together, they formed intent. The hardest discovery came just after lunch. A voice memo. Not because either of them meant to preserve it. Because Connor, like many mediocre men, was lazy with his devices. He'd recorded himself after a dinner with Natalie and forgotten to delete it. 8 minutes, 42 seconds. Mostly nonsense. Complaints about steak temperature. A parking receipt. Then, 2 minutes in, Natalie's voice in the background, clear enough. He won't fight if we frame it as care. Connor laughing. You sure? A pause. Then Natalie again. Julian only goes hard when he thinks the room is honest. I sat there listening to my own wife reduce the map of my mind to usable terrain. It is a distinct humiliation, hearing yourself described accurately by someone who meant to exploit the accuracy. Priya muted the file halfway through and asked if I wanted a break. No, I said. Play the rest. The rest was more of the same. Not criminal enough to thrill a prosecutor, maybe. But devastating in the slow administrative ways that matter in divorce, in governance reviews, in private reputation ecosystems where money and access decide who gets believed over cocktails. By Friday, 3 parallel tracks were moving. Track 1, Containment. Freeze questionable payments. Secure internal systems. Limit all family-adjacent access. Track 2, Legal. Filing preparation for separation, injunctions around certain shared financial mechanisms, preservation notices. Track 3, Human. Quietly informing the people who mattered enough to be misled later. I dreaded the human track most. Not investors. Not lawyers. My Aunt Vivian, who still sent Natalie orchids on birthdays. My mother's sister Denise, who thought marriage vows were a species of holy architecture. Old family friends who had toasted us in Nantucket and kept framed wedding photos in their guest hall. Explaining betrayal to practical people is straightforward. Explaining it to romantics feels like vandalism. Saturday night brought the first public counterattack. Natalie posted a photograph to social media from our back terrace. No caption beyond a white heart and a dove emoji. In the picture she wore cream cashmere, no wedding ring, eyes slightly puffy, expression composed into tasteful suffering. Within 12 minutes the comments filled with concern. Stay strong. Protect your peace. Praying for your family. The modern world has found a way to industrialize ambiguity. I stared at it in the hotel suite and felt a laugh coming that never fully became one. Claire, who was beside me with a laptop, said, "She is weaponizing beige." I handed her the phone. "That's a felony in some countries," she said. Do I respond? Absolutely not. Why not? Because vague pain thrives on reaction. Let her fish in silence. Claire was right. She often is. But silence is easier when you don't understand what you're losing by keeping it. Over the next 3 days, I discovered the social ecosystem around a marriage breaks in layers. First curiosity. Then speculation. Then camps. Friends who call both people and think that makes them balanced. Couples who like Natalie more because she remembered birthdays. Men who prefer the wounded wife narrative because it lets them feel protective without learning facts. Women who called Claire instead of me because female distress is legible to society in ways male betrayal never quite is. On Monday morning, I got a call from Owen Mercer, one of our minority investors, and a man so direct he makes honesty sound like an insult. He didn't say hello. He said, "Is it true your wife tried to slide the company to her brother while your father was barely in the ground?" I looked out over the river. It was raining again. Yes. Unbelievable. Yes. Then he said something I did not expect. Your father worried you loved peace too much. That stung because it was true. Owen continued. He told me that 2 years earlier, after a tense board dinner, my father had said Julian sees 12 moves ahead but still hopes people will choose not to be stupid. The problem with that is stupid people treat hope like permission. I asked Owen if this was supposed to comfort me. No, he said. It's supposed to remind you that he knew you. And he still trusted you with the whole thing. That call mattered more than it should have. Because grief keeps muttering one ugly question under everything else. Did I fail him? Not just at the end. Before it. By marrying her. By bringing her near. By insisting, during a dozen half-arguments over the years, that Natalie only needed time with him, more chances, more proof, more trust. I had vouched for her. Repeatedly. That fact sat heavier than any legal filing. Late that afternoon, Priya sent word that Natalie wanted a settlement conversation before formal service. Efficient, Claire said when I told her. Predatory animals don't enjoy paperwork either. I agreed to meet. Not alone. Never alone again, not in matters where language could later be edited by whoever needed a cleaner story. We chose a private conference suite at the hotel. Neutral ground. Witnesses nearby. Glass walls with the shades half drawn, so no one could claim secrecy and nobody else could hear details. Natalie arrived exactly on time in dove gray silk and low heels, carrying no bag. That was deliberate too. Unencumbered hands looked sincere. With her came a family law attorney named Denise Heller, formidable jaw, immaculate notes, eyes already tired with the knowledge that her client was both elegant and likely difficult. Priya sat beside me. Claire waited in the adjacent room because I knew if Natalie said 3 specific kinds of thing, my sister would want the legal right to appear from thin air like a wrathful specialist summoned by insult. Natalie began without preamble. This has escalated beyond necessity. I folded my hands. You attempted to seize succession control. I attempted to create continuity under emotional duress. For yourself and Connor. For the family. There it was a third time. The family. I wondered whether she heard how revealing it was or whether repetition had naturalized the lie even inside her own skull. Heller stepped in. My client disputes any characterization involving improper intent. Your client wrote timing window in an email while my father was dying. Heller did not blink. She had likely read worse. We are not here to relitigate emotion, she said. We are here to discuss whether dissolution can proceed with discretion. Discretion is expensive, I said. Natalie leaned forward slightly. Then let's be adults. You keep the company. Obviously. Connor is out. Fine. We unwind shared exposure, keep the matter private, and move on. Move on. As though the last decade were a lease ending. What do you want? I asked. For the first time all meeting, she answered with something close to truth. A clean ending. Clean for whom? For both of us. No, I said. Clean for you. Her nostrils flared once. And there it was again, the offended shock of a person encountering a mirror with teeth. I told her there would be no private mythology. No mutual statement about growing apart. No carefully curated language about grief changing us. Facts would remain facts in every binding forum that mattered. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said the most honest thing I'd heard from her in weeks. You are enjoying this. I considered it. No, I said. But I am done protecting you from the cost. You might think that sentence ended the marriage. It didn't. Truthfully, the marriage had ended in pieces over years, maybe from the beginning if I'm being cruel enough to myself. What ended that afternoon was the fantasy that endings arrive as singular dramatic moments. They don't. Usually they arrive as administration. Inventory. Password resets. Counsel copied. Jewelry appraised. Staff informed not to release schedules. Locks changed at the lake house. Foundation board seats reviewed. Every romance, if it lives long enough, eventually encounters logistics. Ours died there. The divorce process moved faster than most because speed favors the person with fewer illusions left. Natalie contested some characterizations, abandoned others, and fought hardest where reputation and liquid access intersected. She wanted the Hunting Valley house. She wanted a structured payment framed as lifestyle continuity rather than distribution. She wanted language in the filing that kept all governance allegations outside the central narrative. She did not get most of what she wanted. Her attorney remained excellent. The facts remained better. Connor, meanwhile, tried the oldest failing man maneuver in the book. He started calling people privately to explain himself. This never works as well as men like Connor imagine because they mistake social familiarity for moral credit. He called Richard first, which was ambitious. Richard listened for 11 minutes and then told him, in the kindest possible old money diction, that opportunism during a burial window is not a misunderstanding, it's a character reference. He called Owen Mercer next and received what I later heard described as a verbal autopsy. He called 2 of our minority lenders and was politely reminded he held no title, no authority, and no recognized position beyond being a cautionary anecdote. Then, incredibly, he called Claire. I was in Priya's office when Claire texted me only 4 words. He chose violence, apparently. She called 5 minutes later and put him on speaker without telling him. Connor began with the confidence of a man who still believes charm is a form of oxygen. Claire, I think things have gotten distorted. I'm trying to make sure family doesn't become collateral damage. Claire said, family became collateral damage when your sister emailed you a conquest schedule over our father's deathbed. He sputtered something about context. Claire said, the wonderful thing about written records is that context usually arrives attached. Then, because she is my sister and because God occasionally decides to take a side, she added, also, if you call me again, I will find a way to have your name become educational material for women between 22 and 35 learning how not to marry charisma with loafers. He did not call back. Work, strangely enough, helped. Maybe not strangely. Work had always been the place my father and I translated emotion into usefulness. In the 3 weeks after the attempted takeover, I spent more time on plant floors than I had in years. Toledo first. Then Youngstown. Then the smaller machining facility outside Akron that everybody forgot about until its quarterly margins saved them from embarrassment. I walked lines, checked safety reports, ate in cafeterias, took questions from supervisors who had known me since I was 19 and still instinctively scanned my face for traces of the boy trying too hard in borrowed authority. They had heard rumors, of course. Factories hear everything. But on a plant floor, respect is still refreshingly simple. Can you answer directly? Do you understand what we do? Will payroll clear? Is the contract real? Are you going to vanish into some executive weather system while the rest of us carry the metal? At Toledo, an older line lead named Sergio shook my hand and said, "Your dad would have thrown that brother-in-law through a conference table." I told him he probably would have. Sergio nodded. Then he looked me over once and added, "But maybe doing paperwork at him hurts longer." That might be the wisest thing anyone said all quarter. There is a version of this story, the internet version maybe, where I would tell you I never missed Natalie after leaving the house. That would be cleaner. Also false. I missed habits. Morning coffee poured before I asked. The way she straightened my tie knot with one finger and thumb. The speed with which she could reduce a chaotic room to order before guests arrived. The fact that she always knew where my passport was when I didn't. I missed the architecture of being accompanied. None of that meant she had loved me well. It meant routine is adhesive. People survive terrible things longer than they should because repetition starts masquerading as safety. One night, about 5 weeks in, I was back in the hotel suite reading through deposition prep when I found myself opening an old photo album on my phone. St. Bartholomew. Christmas in Aspen. The terrible fundraiser in Miami where a billionaire's art collection had included a 6-foot sculpture of a spoon, and Natalie whispered, with straight-faced elegance, that it represented inherited uselessness. I laughed so hard champagne came out my nose that night. In the photo she is looking at me, not the camera, genuinely amused. I sat there staring at the image and felt grief split along a second seam. Not just my father. The woman I thought existed. That is another thing no one tells you. Betrayal produces bereavement of fiction. You don't only lose the person. You lose the version of reality in which the person was who you believed. I nearly called her. That shames me a little even now. Not because I think weakness is shameful. Because the urge came from loneliness wearing nostalgia's coat. Instead I called Owen Mercer. He answered on the third ring and said, "If this is about second thoughts, pour a drink, don't make a phone call." I hate that people know me this well, I said. That's because your father spent years curating witnesses. We talked for 20 minutes. Mostly about nothing. Markets. My father's impossible standards. Owen's knee replacement. Before hanging up he said something that stayed. Missing what was familiar is not evidence that it was safe. I wrote that down. By early autumn, the governance review had produced enough findings to formalize internal policy changes my father would have approved of and mocked for being necessary. Expanded family access restrictions. Stronger dual approval requirements during executive bereavement or medical crises. Communication firewall rules. Enhanced metadata retention. We also quietly replaced 2 external consultants Natalie had cultivated through the foundation orbit, both of whom turned out to have regarded private corporate transition chatter as a kind of cocktail hobby. The first real public fracture in Natalie's narrative came at a charity auction in Pepper Pike, 2 months after separation. I almost didn't attend. Claire insisted. "If you vanish long enough," she said, "people will let the prettier liar keep the room." So I went. Black tie. Small crowd. Lots of lacquered certainty and old names pinned to donor walls. Natalie arrived late in emerald silk, alone, and for 24 minutes executed the performance of dignified endurance so beautifully I almost admired the workmanship. People leaned toward her, touched her arm, spoke in gentle tones. She tilted her head just enough to appear brave under strain. Then Marianne arrived. Marianne, who feared nobody and loved theater only when truth was doing the acting. She crossed the room, greeted Natalie with the sort of neutral civility diplomats use before sanctions, and then spent the next hour in visible conversation with 3 bored spouses, one of whom happened to chair a museum foundation, another of whom happened to hate being manipulated, and the third of whom had already heard half the story and only needed one clean sentence to attach the rest. Marianne's clean sentence, I later learned, was this. There's a difference between supporting a grieving husband and forwarding your brother's resume over the funeral flowers. Social ecosystems correct slowly. Then all at once. Within 10 days, Natalie was still invited places but no longer centered there. Women who once called her first for committee chairs suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Men who had enjoyed being charmed by her now discovered moral discomfort once the facts became reputationally inconvenient. She wasn't exiled. Wealthy circles rarely exile beautifully. They simply chill, and the chill is its own kind of sentence. Connor's decline was less elegant. His whiskey venture collapsed when one of his private backers discovered he had floated himself to prospective partners as soon-to-be interim head of Vale Industrial, implying access he never had. A golf club membership stalled. 2 women I vaguely knew began referring to him, within hearing distance, as that opportunistic peacock. I am not proud that this pleased me. Actually, that's not true. I am a little proud. Not of the pleasure. Of finally being honest about it. The legal end came on a wet Thursday in November, nearly 8 months after my father died. The settlement conference lasted 6 hours, 2 broken pens, and 1 aborted attempt by Natalie's counsel to revive the notion of mutual communication failures as a dignified frame. Priya ended that attempt by placing the email chain, the voice memo transcript, and the Shell Consulting draft invoices in a neat stack between us like place settings. Natalie did not look at me much that day. When she did, her face held neither hatred nor grief. Only depletion. There is a stage some manipulative people enter when consequence finally outlasts strategy. They do not become better. They simply become tired of losing. We signed. The marriage ended. The sky outside remained offensively normal. I walked out with a folded copy of the final terms in my inside pocket and felt nothing dramatic. No triumph. No collapse. Mostly hunger. Claire took me to dinner and raised a glass of Chianti. To legal closure, she said, civilization's least romantic miracle. I drank to that. After the divorce, I moved into a smaller place on the edge of Bradenall overlooking the lake. Not humble. Let's not fictionalize. But simpler. Dark floors. Fewer rooms. No decorators. No performance furniture. I kept my father's drafting table in the den, my mother's blue ceramic bowl in the kitchen, and exactly 1 wedding photo in a drawer I did not open for months. Work expanded. We closed the aerospace contract. Sold 1 underperforming subsidiary I should have shed 2 years earlier. Acquired a robotics calibration firm in Columbus that gave us an edge my father had wanted long before the board was brave enough to say yes. I began spending every Friday at a different facility or vendor site, a habit meant partly for culture and partly, if I'm honest, because movement left less room for memory to harden. Somewhere inside that year, people started treating me differently. Not because of the money. Not because of title. Because the story had gone around. Underestimation, endured publicly and survived without spectacle, creates a peculiar kind of authority. Men who used to offer advice started asking for it. Women I'd known peripherally for years began speaking to me without the soft pity reserved for wives' mistakes, as if the ordeal had burned off some social varnish and revealed a more usable shape underneath. I didn't entirely like this. But I noticed it. In December, I visited my father's grave alone for the first time since the headstone had been set. Gray granite. Not polished. Sandblasted lettering. Efficient, severe, exactly what he would have pretended not to care about and secretly approved. I stood there in the cold with my hands in my coat pockets and told him, out loud because death has a way of making private conversation feel structurally reasonable, that the company was steady, Claire was sleeping too little, Natalie was gone, Connor was irrelevant, and the golden share had done its job. Wind moved through the bare branches. Somewhere behind me, a maintenance cart beeped while reversing. Life, continuing with appalling confidence. I told him one more thing. You were right. That was hard. Not because I resent being wrong. Because sons never stop hoping they'll eventually get to become fully adult without ever again discovering their father had seen farther. The answer, apparently, is no. You just get older and find new distances where he was already standing. I wish I could say that after all of this I emerged transformed into some cleaner, wiser, less vain man. But growth is usually less cinematic. I became more selective. Less easily flattered by polish. Quicker to ask what incentives are hiding beneath beautiful language. More attentive to the venues in which people choose to be loyal. That's the important part, I think. Not what they say when a room is watching. What they do when you're weak enough for betrayal to be convenient. There was one more scene, though, that belongs in this story because it taught me something I had almost missed. Every January, Vail Industrial hosts a winter operations summit. Not glamorous. No string quartet. No ice sculpture spelling ambition in uppercase. Just plant leaders, finance heads, procurement teams, safety managers, and a handful of board members in a converted training hall behind headquarters where the coffee is too strong and nobody bothers pretending slides matter more than throughput. My father loved that meeting because the people in it were useful. He said you could tell whether a company was healthy by how many real answers survived fluorescent lighting. The first summit after his death landed 10 months after the boardroom fight. I nearly cancelled the tribute segment HR kept suggesting. My father would have hated a tribute segment. But Marianne talked me out of that instinct. Not because she believed in sentiment. Because she believed memory, properly handled, is operational. People need to know what remains, she said. So I stood at the front of that ugly bright room in front of 112 employees and managers, looked out at faces my father had argued with, promoted, terrified, defended, and occasionally insulted into greatness, and I told them the truth. Not the polished truth. The useful one. I told them Elias Vail had not been easy, but he had been real. That he cared more about whether payroll cleared in a bad quarter than whether the annual report sounded visionary. That he believed the cleanest factory floor in the world still meant nothing if the people running it couldn't pay for braces, insulin, tuition, or tires. I told them he trusted systems because systems outlive moods. I told them he had expected me to make mistakes, just not the same expensive mistake twice. That got a laugh. Then I told them something else. I said the company had taken a hit the previous year from an attempted internal power grab during a season of family loss. No names. No gossip. No cheap theater. Just fact. And I told them the reason we were still standing was not because one man had been brilliant enough to save it alone, but because enough people in the room had chosen standards over convenience when it would have been easier, safer, and probably more profitable in the short term to look away. Marianne, catching a bad invoice. Priya, locking records before stories could be edited. Kelly at reception, saying less than she knew. Plant supervisors refusing to entertain rumors as substitute leadership. People whose names never appear in magazine profiles about industry excellence. The room got very quiet. Then Sergio from Toledo raised one hand from the third row and said, "So what's the lesson, boss?" I remember smiling because my father would have loved the bluntness of that. The lesson, I said, is that companies do not get stolen in one dramatic moment. They get stolen in tiny permissions. In meetings nobody challenges. In vague language nobody defines. In access granted because someone feels awkward saying no. By the time a thief reaches for the safe, 10 smaller acts of politeness have usually already held the door open. You could feel the sentence landing. Not because it was profound. Because everyone in that room had seen some version of it before. In business. In family. In themselves. Afterward, while people were stacking folders and killing the last of the stale pastries, a machinist from Akron named Dolores came up to me. She had worked for my father 23 years and had once made a vice president cry over a missing safety signature. She shook my hand and said, "Your father always knew which wolves were outside the fence. Near the end, I think he was trying to teach you which ones already had keys." I thanked her. Then I went into the corridor and stood there alone for a minute with my throat tight. Because that was it, exactly. Not just wolves. Not just greed. Access. The damage people can do once love, marriage, family, or familiarity has convinced everyone else to stop checking the locks. That summit did something quiet for me. It changed the shape of the story inside my own head. Up to then, I had still been telling it partly as humiliation survived. A private failure dragged through formal channels and made manageable. After that day, I started understanding it differently. Not as the year my wife and her brother almost took my father's company. As the year the right people proved they wouldn't let them. That distinction matters. One version leaves you alone at the center of your own rescue. The other tells the truth about how survival actually works. About a year after the boardroom meeting, I ran into Natalie for the first time since the divorce at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Of course it was there. Places like that are ecosystems for accidental theater. I was attending a donor preview for a manufacturing history exhibit we'd partially funded. She was near the central staircase in black wool and pearls, speaking to a couple I recognized from the symphony board. She saw me at exactly the same moment I saw her. Her posture changed almost imperceptibly, chin lifting a quarter inch, shoulders settling into grace. We were both too well trained socially to flee. So we approached. "Julian," she said. "Natalie. You look well. So do you." There are conversations whose content does not matter at all because the real exchange is structural. Who broke? Who didn't? Who needs witness? Who can leave first without losing face? She asked after Claire. I asked after her mother. She said she had started advising 2 nonprofit arts boards. I said business was steady. It was all perfectly civilized. Then she looked at me with that old assessing intelligence, dimmer now but not gone, and said, "You always did learn faster once the lesson became expensive." I smiled. "And you always mistook that for a compliment," I said. Something in her face shifted. Not pain. Recognition, maybe. Then a man in a charcoal tuxedo approached from behind her with 2 flutes of champagne and the eager uncertainty of somebody new enough not to know the history he had walked into. Natalie turned slightly toward him, introducing us as if we were alumni from the same school. I shook his hand. He had a good grip. Poor bastard. When I left the museum 20 minutes later, I stood for a moment on the top steps looking out at the reflecting pool and felt something close, finally, to the end of anger. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness gets oversold by people who have not had to earn it. What I felt was release from active occupation. Natalie no longer lived inside my attention rent-free. She was a chapter with legal documents attached, a case study in polished appetite, a woman I had once loved and misunderstood thoroughly enough to nearly lose a company over it. That was all. And all, as it turns out, can be wonderfully small once you stop feeding it. If you've stayed with me this far, then you probably understand this story was never only about a company. The company was the stage. The real subject was timing. Who moves when you're wounded? Who mistakes your grief for access? Who confuses quiet with blindness? My wife gave my father's company to her brother while I was grieving because she believed sorrow had hollowed me out, left me too broken to guard what mattered. She believed my father's death had created not just pain, but vacancy. That is the miscalculation at the center of so many betrayals. People see mourning and imagine absence. They see kindness and imagine softness. They see restraint and imagine permission. Sometimes all they're really seeing is a closed hand that hasn't opened yet. What saved me was not rage. Rage is loud and brief. What saved me was a father who understood systems better than sentiment, a sister who could smell vanity through a locked door, two women named Marianne and Priya who treated competence like a moral obligation, and the simple fact that I had spent too many years under Elias' veil not to learn the first rule of real stewardship. If you love something, you do not abandon the controls just because your hands are shaking. You steady them. That's what I did. Not elegantly. Not without nights I nearly broke and one phone call I almost made and too many hours staring at old photographs like a man trying to determine which version of his own life had been counterfeit. But I did it. And the company stayed standing. More than that, I stayed standing. That matters more than I knew then. Because companies can be rebuilt, sold, divided, restructured. Self-respect takes longer. If there's anything worth carrying from my story into your own life, it's this: when somebody betrays you in the season you're weakest, don't rush to prove you're unhurt. Don't spend your last clean energy performing invincibility for an audience that won't pay your bills or restore your peace. Protect the structure first. Secure the records. Learn the incentives. Let truth, not theater, do the heavy lifting. There is an almost unbearable dignity in handling treachery with documentation instead of spectacle. And yes, I know that sounds exactly like something my father would say. He'd hate that I admitted it. Which only makes it truer. These days, when people who know the outline of what happened ask me whether I had any idea before Natalie made her move, I tell them the truth. Yes. I already knew. I knew because my father had seen the weather coming and taught me how to read a barometer. I knew because greed is repetitive, and if you watch long enough it starts leaving fingerprints everywhere. I knew because love, real love, does not start drafting contingency plans around your collapse. And maybe, if I'm being brutally fair, I knew because some part of me had been collecting evidence for years and calling it discomfort so I wouldn't have to rename my own marriage. That's the cruelest knowledge of all, isn't it? Not that someone betrayed you. That some quiet part of you had seen enough to fear it long before your conscious mind was willing to speak. Still, fear isn't failure. Silence isn't blindness forever. And grief, however heavy, is not surrender. If you've ever been underestimated because you were mourning, if anyone has ever mistaken your heartbreak for an unlocked door, I want you to hear me clearly: being in pain does not mean you are no longer dangerous. It does not mean your mind has left the room. It does not mean the things you built become public property for the nearest smiling opportunist. Sometimes the strongest move you'll ever make in your life happens with red eyes, no sleep, and a funeral still fresh in the air. If you've lived something like that, tell me in the comments. Tell me about the moment someone discovered grief had not made you weak, only quiet. And if stories like this mean something to you, stay close. There are more of them. More rooms where the wrong person thought they had control. More tables where status sat down before truth and ended up leaving alone. Subscribe if you want those stories when they drop. Take care of yourselves. Protect what matters while you still can. And never let anyone convince you that mourning is the same thing as emptiness.